Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at the BGVP DM8. Now that's a lot of consonants all in a row, but what that means is we're looking at an IEM from the company called BGVP, and it's called the DM8. The 8 refers to the number of balanced armatures being used, so these are very much a complex multi-driver flagship for BGVP. Before I get into the review, I just want to thank Melbourne Hi-Fi Audio for making this review possible. They put me in touch with BGVP and arranged this unit to be sent out for review. So thank you Melbourne Hi-Fi Audio, and for anyone in Australia looking to buy, I'll put a link down below so you can say thanks to them by buying through their store. There's no affiliations or kickbacks there, it's just a way of saying thank you. For now though, let me introduce the DM8. This is a $340 US or 540 Australian dollar IEM. So even though it's a flagship for BGVP, it's actually not that expensive in the scheme of IEMs. It sits once again squarely in that category of Chi-Fi, meaning that it's one of those Chinese-made audiophile products, and that's part of what keeps the price lower. The Chinese market is extremely good at producing pretty well-performing IEMs at very low prices, and so I was excited to see if this could perform better than its price tag suggested, or whether it was just an example of getting exactly what you pay for. And I'm not going to give it away too much because it's been a bit of a complex journey with the DM8s. To start to explain why that's the case, let me show you what you get when you buy the DM8s. First of all, you get the IEMs themselves and a really nice multi-stranded cable that's got a brown sheathing on it, so it's very kind of low-key and subtle, which I actually like. It's finished in a 2.5mm plug for balance connections, but also comes with adapters for 3.5mm single-ended and 4.4mm balanced pentacon. So it's a really great offering in terms of the cable. It's a 6N copper cable, meaning it's very high purity, and in my testing with the extremely good Aries Ikigai cable, the cable that's stock with the BGVP comes pretty close, so that's saying it's an exceptionally good quality copper cable, so that in itself is a real bonus. As you might have guessed if you're familiar with the Ikigai from my review, it's there for an MMCX connector into the housings, which I can't get off right now, but when you do, it's a very clean flush fitted MMCX within the acrylic shell of the DM8s themselves. So these are a nice compact shell given that there's 8 drivers per side. They've done a great job at planning the placement and location of each of those drivers so that the shell stays nice and small and therefore is a really ergonomic fit. If I take off the tips for a moment, and I'll show you this on the close-up glamour videos, but the tip itself is more like a custom tip rather than a universal, meaning that it's all molded out of the acrylic and it comes to a point with 3 separate sound tube openings. So overall, it's a beautifully made IEM both in terms of look and feel, but at the same time, one thing I'm not such a fan of, and it's a really minor gripe, is that fitting some silicone tips to this kind of custom style nozzle can be a little bit tricky and the tips want to pop off. So that's a really minor gripe. Once you get the tip in place, it's fine, but some of them just don't want to go on quite so well. Speaking of tips, let's talk now about some of the other bits and pieces that you get in the box. When the DM8s arrive, they come with these pink tips fitted. And these are a bit weird because also in the box are 3 different sets of silicone tips and a set of foam tips, none of which are the same as these. So this is like one random different tip in a single size only, whereas everything else you get are in multiple sizes, except the foam because the foam's going to conform to your ear shape. So it's a really interesting thing that they've included this one single tip, which is differently tuned to the others, and we'll talk about that soon. It's interesting they've included this in one size only when all of the others you get multiple choices. As you'll see shortly, the tips do make a big difference, and that's why I'm emphasizing the point that you only get one size of the pink. I'm going to talk a bit more about the tips in a moment, but first let's talk about the one final thing I haven't mentioned, which is the carry case. Now, I'm not a huge fan of these carry cases. I find that they're pretty ubiquitous now. They're coming in every product you get out of the Chinese market, it seems, at a certain price point at least. The issue I have with them is that by the time you get a decent sized IEM and a decent thickness cable all coiled up in here, it does get a bit squeezy. So I'm not a huge fan of that. It's not, again, a deal breaker or a major gripe, but it is a minor kind of drawback, I guess, if you like. I would much prefer to see a slightly more spacious case like the one I've got here with the Tin Hifi P2s, which I'll be comparing to the DM8 shortly. Before we get to the comparisons though, I just want to talk a bit more about this tip situation. So in the case, the tips are labelled as things like balanced, vocal, and bass ear tips. But I honestly think that's a really bad idea on the part of BGVP, because what I've found in my measurements and also my listening is that the sound I'm getting from these tips doesn't always equate to what's written on them, particularly in the case of the bass tips. So before I show you the actual measurements of these, what I want to talk about is my experience listening to the DM8s and what I found journeying through the different tips. My initial experience when picking up the DM8s for the first time, putting them in my ears with these pink tips fitted, was a really enjoyable one. They came across as a fairly neutral, maybe slightly warm sounding IEM with a nice sense of space in the soundstage and a really nice mid-range. As I journeyed through the tips though, what I found was that sometimes I really enjoyed them, sometimes I really didn't enjoy them, and it really varied from one track to the next. Having so many choices and so many different ways to listen to them, I found myself swinging between really enjoying them and being super impressed, and then also at times finding them a little bit subpar. So let me talk you through my experiences from the beginning of my experience through to the end and what I settled on in terms of tips. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on the measurements here, partly because there's so much to talk about in all the different tips available, also because I find the mini DSP ears that I measure them with is not particularly good with IEMs, particularly with foam tips I don't even bother, because the ear canals are quite small, quite sticky, and strange things happen with the silicon tips and the foam tips that can often distort the way they measure compared to the way they sound. So I'm going to show you the measurements, but I'm not going to get too stuck on them, and I recommend that you don't get too hung up on them either. So starting with the pink tips, my first reaction listening to these was that the sound was smooth, really nicely extended, there was a good sense of bass, a nice sense of treble, everything was really well presented. They weren't blowing me away, but at the same time, I couldn't fault them. They were really enjoyable, very kind of a liquid, smooth sound, but not thick in any way. So there was great detail, great texture, but nothing was being forced at me. I did notice though, as I moved through a bunch of different tips, that occasionally the pink tips could be just a little bit fatiguing. And as time went by, what I discovered was that's a bit of a common trend across many tips with the DM8. So it's something that you're going to need to choose your tips carefully, but it's also a slight issue with their tuning and the spike in the upper treble. So one particular track I listened to while I had the pink tips on was Woke Up in Japan by 5 Seconds of Summer. That's not a particularly well recorded track, but it's not bad either. What I found though as I listened to it was that with the pink tips, the DM8s did become a bit fatiguing as the track progressed. As you'll hear, the pink tips are one of the better tips in my opinion with the DM8s, so that's going to give you a bit of foreshadowing as to where we're going with some of the others. The next tip I moved to was the clear tip, which is the bass tip. Now, as I said already, I don't know what's gone wrong. I don't know how BGVP have decided that that's a bass tip, because if you see the comparison graph on screen now, I've got the pink tip and the clear tip or the bass tip, and the bass tip clearly has less bass. So I don't really understand what they were thinking there in calling it a bass tip. Maybe somebody put the wrong tips on the wrong card when they assembled it. I'm not really sure what was going on, but what I can tell you is the clear tips were by far my least favourite of everything in the box. The only real benefit that the clear tips gave in my mind was that they opened up the soundstage a bit, which is often the case if you remove the bass, but in all other ways they were less enjoyable and they further enhanced that sense of dryness in the treble of the DM8s. So I don't recommend the clear tips unless you really want a leaner and slightly harsher, drier sound, then perhaps go for that. But I really don't see why anyone would actually prefer that, and so my recommendation is to look at the other tips in the box. Which brings us to the next tip, being the white core tip. Now the white core tip is actually the middle size in the vocal tips. They have a yellow core, a white core and a black core. So what you'd expect with those tips is a bit of emphasis in the mid-range or the upper mid-range to bring forward the vocals and give them a better sense of clarity. What I heard was that things were starting to get better in terms of tonal balance compared to the clear tips, but it still wasn't great for me. The sound was a little bit leaner than I like it, and it was still a little bit dry. The good news is, by bringing a bit of extra bass back into the mix compared to the clear tip, things did become a bit more cohesive, so the bit of extra warmth from the extra bass helped to pull things together, hold the soundstage together, and make for a better overall presentation. But to me, there was still some edginess or dryness in the upper treble, and even though the vocals were probably nicely enhanced compared to the clear, and maybe even the pink a little bit, it still wasn't for me a great presentation. Now I probably should mention at this point, and in fact I probably should have said this at the very beginning of this section, that ear tips are going to be really personal, because it all comes down to how deep the insertion is in your ear, the shape of your ear canal, how the different resonances of your ear canal play out. So you may have slightly different experiences to me when listening to these tips. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, and more importantly is probably to take away from this the fact that there is variability of the tuning with the DM8s because you do get so many tips given to you. I personally don't think all of the tips are particularly good for the DM8s, but as I said, it might be different for other people with different shaped ear canals. So let's move on now to where things started to get good again, and that was with the grey tips, which are known as the balance tips. This for me was where the DM8s started to get really enjoyable again. There was a better sense of overall balance to the sound. I liked the overall sense of sound staging produced. It was a really good overall experience. One thing that's quite interesting is I wrote in my notes that the grey tip to me was the most extended sounding of all of them in terms of the treble. So it sounded like the treble extended higher in the frequency range and there was a bit more energy up top. And indeed, the graphs would suggest that that's true. So I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if it's to do with the depth of insertion, because the grey tip is a bit shallower than some of the others, or perhaps it's to do with the materials that the tips are made out of. I'm not entirely sure, but something is going on that produces a little bit more extension from the grey tips. And in my mind, because of their overall better sonic balance from bass through treble, they were my pick of the bunch if you're using the tips that come with the DM8s. It had come to a toss-up for me between the grey and the pink. Again, the pink only come in one size, so you've got to hope that that's your size. It roughly equates to a medium based on the other tips. So at this point, I wasn't quite finished with the tips, despite finding 2 tips that I quite liked and 2 tips that I really didn't like too much. I still had the foam tips to try, and to cut this pretty short, it was okay, but it wasn't great. The foam tip actually reminded me most of the vocal tip, but in some ways not as good. It was almost like it was producing some additional resonance or reflection somewhere that was just adding a little bit of extra edge to the treble that I didn't necessarily enjoy. It might have just been that it was emphasizing a different frequency or taming a frequency that threw off the sonic balance and produced that sense of harshness or dryness, but ultimately for me I didn't particularly like the foam tips that were provided with the DM8s, and so I went straight back to the silicons. Enjoying this video? If you are and you'd like to help me make more videos like this one, there are lots of ways you can help, and most of them don't cost you a cent. You can help for free by liking this video, subscribing and ringing the bell, sharing this video on social media or your favourite audio forums, or by making your next purchases using any of the affiliate links in the description. Obviously that's not technically free, but you're not spending anything extra and it all helps out. Want to go a step further? You could buy some merchandise, t-shirt, hoodies, caps and the like, or you can join the Passion for Sound family on Patreon. It's a growing community with plenty of interesting discussion and your chance to influence what happens on the channel. Check out the description for more information and links where relevant. But for now, let's get back to the video. Having done all of the tip rolling with the included tips, the final things I tried were spiral dots and spin fits. The spin fits were an instant no for me. I didn't enjoy them at all on the DM8s, and so instead I went for the spiral dots, which were probably one of my favourite tips overall with the DM8s. The spiral dots provided an interesting balance between the pink tips and the grey tips. They brought a good sense of soundstage size and shape, a really nice sense of image focus, and a good balance in the bass. The mid-range had good texture and clarity, but it was just a tiny little bit thin, and that's probably my one drawback with the spiral dots, is I didn't feel like they gave me the warmth that something like the pink tip did. So in the end, I think for me, the DM8s have a strength in that they give you lots of different options depending on the tips you use. When it comes down to it, I'd probably switch back and forth between spiral dots, the grey tips, and the pink tips, depending on my mood, and maybe eventually I'd settle on one, but none of them are quite perfect, and that's probably the one thing that left me questioning exactly where I rate the DM8s. But it's not all bad. I'm going to tell you some really good things about them in just a second. The DM8s to me are a little bit of an interesting IEM in that they're very, very enjoyable. They're extremely good at what they do, but they're just not quite perfect. Having said that, they're a $300 odd IEM, and so they shouldn't be expected to get everything just right, because I'm yet to find one in that range that actually does. And my comparisons in a moment will help to put that in perspective. Before I get to those comparisons, I just want to give you a couple of track-specific examples of what I think the DM8s do really, really well. Now, these notes were taken while I was listening with the spiral dots, but they'll translate pretty well to the spiral dots, or the grey tips, or even the pink tips, if you just think of the pink tips as being a slightly thicker, warmer sound, but still carrying many of the same characteristics. One of the first tracks I tried was Black Star by David Bowie. Now, this has popped up a few times in my testing lately, so you've probably heard me talk about it quite a bit, but it's a really nice track for testing. The whole album is actually. With the spiral dots on, what I was really impressed with by the DM8s was the fact that their tonal accuracy was really, really excellent. Everything sounded realistic. The drums, the cymbals, the vocals, and the other thing that really stood out to me while I'm talking vocals was the texture in David Bowie's voice was really, really noticeable, and in a good way. It wasn't over-enhanced. It was just really clearly rendered. So I thoroughly enjoyed them in that regard. It's not as though they've reached quite the heights of the absolute best IEMs I've heard, say the Meza Audio Pentas, the 64 Audio U12Ts. They don't quite reach that height, but they do an extremely good job at the price point they're at. I then switched over to Angel by Massive Attack, and it did show that the bass from the DM8s, as you'll have seen in all the measurements, does roll off a little bit early. So the bass extension was just a little bit lacking, but at the same time, the sense of space they produce is very, very good for the price. And again, the textural information, all of the finer micro details are really beautifully rendered. So I think that's something you need to take into account. When you're buying an IEM at this price point, you're generally going to be trading off the almost perfection that you get at the higher levels. In the case of the DM8, you're getting a really good sense of soundstage, you're getting a beautiful image focus, there's good width, there's good size, there's good space between instruments, but you are trading off a little bit of bass extension. There's other IEMs on the market, as I'll talk about shortly, that might do better bass extension, but then you're trading off some of those micro details and some of that soundstage size. So it's always going to be a little bit of compromise when you're spending less than some of those flagship level IEMs. That's not to say you have to buy $1,000, $2,000 IEMs to get enjoyable sound. These are incredibly enjoyable and good fun. It's just a matter of pointing out that you do get more for your money when you spend a bit more on an IEM. And so with that in mind, let's talk about a couple of selected comparisons. As always, I'd love to compare these with every IEM within or near the price range, but the reality is I can only work with what I've got here at the time. And in this case, two of the IEMs that I have that I think might be relevant to this discussion are the See Audio Yume and also the Tin Hifi P2. The reason I've selected these two is that the Yume is a cheaper option and something that you might look at and think, is it worth spending the extra? And the P2 is almost identically priced to the DM8s and therefore would be a direct competitor. So let's start with the See Audio Yume. At $169, it's basically half the price of the DM8s. It comes with a very similar carry case, a fairly similar cable as well, although it is single-ended only, and also very similar shells in the sense that they're an acrylic shell that's very nicely made, and in this case has a metal nozzle instead of the molded acrylic nozzle. So in all ways, they're very similar, but in the case of the Yume, slightly downgraded in terms of the cable being not quite as good a cable and also not balance terminated. The Yume is also a hybrid versus the all balanced armature design of the DM8s. So listening to the two side by side, they've actually got quite a lot of similarities. The Yume is probably a little bit lighter in the bass response compared to the DM8s, but they're both very good Very spacious sort of presentations, both very enjoyable overall. Because of its slightly lower bass levels, the Yume does have a slightly more open sound at times, and that can work well on some tracks, but the treble coming from it is not as well refined as the DM8. So I've already said the DM8's treble is not perfect, so think of this on a continuum where you've got dreadful treble down here, you've got pretty good treble here, then you get to the Yume, then you get to the DM8, and then you get to those ultimate flagships further up. So both of these sit better than average, but the DM8 is better again than the Yume. One of the tracks I listened to when comparing these two was Cry to Be Found by Delamitri. Now that's not a particularly well recorded album, but not all albums are, so I thought it was a good test of these two to see how they handle on just average pop material. And whilst the Yume was good, I found it was just a little bit too forward in the mids and treble because of that slightly lower bass levels, and it left it feeling just a little bit thin or hollow at times. The bass extension from the Yume is good, but at the same time it had a sense of the treble being in one chunk and the bass in another and not being particularly well joined together. Whereas the DM8 married everything together in a much more coherent overall picture. On a really well recorded track, I'd probably say you could get away with either of these as being a really good option, and therefore you might question why you'd buy one over the other. But on a lesser recorded track, or a track that requires that nice sense of coherency between the bass and the treble, I do think that's where the DM8 shows why it's worth twice as much as the See Audio Yume. So having identified that the DM8 is the better choice out of the two, and in my opinion is worth the extra money if you're in a position to spend it, the question then comes down to, if you're going to spend that much money, is it worth looking at something like the Tin Hifi P2? The Tin Hifi P2, as I've reviewed here recently on the channel, is a planar magnetic IEM, making it fairly unique. Now, planar magnetic IEMs are pretty rare, and in conversation with an IEM designer, there's a reason for that. They're not always going to be the best choice when you're working with such a small driver. However, Tin Hifi have now produced 2 generations of planar magnetics, this being the second, and I quite like the P2 so long as it's got the foam tips on there. This was an IEM that I found equally as tip dependent, possibly more so than the DM8s. They're also priced pretty much identically and come with really similar accessories in a high quality balanced terminated cable, a nice range of tips, and obviously the adapters to go from balanced to single ended or 4.4mm as well. So they're very comparable in every single way, and the question then for me came down to sound quality. 2 things that are worth noting in this comparison is that the P2 is a little bit less comfortable for me compared to the DM8s, which are fantastic. It's also much harder to drive, being a much less efficient setup. As I listened to the two for comparisons, I had a whole range of different music playing, and a couple of the tracks that came on were good to highlight what both of these IEMs do well and not so well in comparison. The first one was American Tune by Paul Simon. In this track, both IEMs did really well, and whilst they were both very different, I could happily enjoy either. The P2 sound was very liquid, smooth, with still lots of detail, but just everything was very effortless from the P2, and I really enjoyed that. Flipping over to the DM8s though, I was suddenly hearing texture and detail in the orchestral backings that the P2 didn't bring forward quite so well. That might come down to sensitivity and how well the DM8s respond to very fine fluctuations in the signal, whereas perhaps the P2s, being harder to drive, are also a little bit more resistant to those fine subtle variations. For the record, I was driving them with the Chord Mojo, so power output was definitely not an issue, and as I said, both of them sounded wonderful, and I would have been happy with either. So one of the next tracks that came on that I thought was quite revealing of these two was a track called Right Back by Johnny Lang. This is a blues rock track, and it gave me a much better sense of some of the dynamics of these two, particularly the fact that in the bass registers, the P2 has much better extension down low. The DM8 came across as having a bit better punch and weight in the mid-bass, but the extension of the P2 really showed through that it was going the full range from sub-bass all the way through to treble. Having said that, the P2's balance was just a little bit off, where it was like there was a bit of a hole in the bass, and so there was this nice sub-bass kick, then a little bit of a hole or a lacking of weight, and then the treble was just a little bit tinny up top. Having said that, the overall sound, and this is going to sound like a contradiction, the overall sound was more coherent overall, and that is to say that even though there were some irregularities in the frequency response, the sound came forward as one picture, just with a slightly altered or artificial frequency response, if that makes sense. To maybe explain that in a different way, the DM8s separated everything out more, so there was more space between everything, but in producing a bit more space, it also pulled everything apart just a little bit more and left things sounding a little bit less coherent, like it was one musical performance rather than a whole lot of individual recordings of instruments. So in that regard, they were both good, but they both also again weren't quite perfect, and as I said before, at this price point you don't expect them to be. As a conclusion, having listened to both, I think I'd say the DM8 is the slightly better all-rounder of the two, and I'm talking purely sonically here, so if we take out the fact that the DM8 is more comfortable and easier to drive, if we're just talking sonically, I do also think the DM8 is the better all-round performer. It does lack a bit of bass extension, but I think the overall package of soundstage size, subtle textural and micro detail, and the fact that it does have a little bit more punch in the mid-bass gives it a bit of a win for me across lots of different genres. The P2 is a little bit stronger in terms of that really liquid sound it delivers, with that nice sense of coherency in terms of all the sound clearly coming from one point source. In that regard, it's really good, but the tonal balance to me is just not quite as strong as the DM8, and on some tracks that's going to be a problem, on other tracks it's not going to be an issue at all. The P2 is probably the more technically linear sounding earphone of the two, whereas the DM8 does have a few lumps and bumps and does have that roll off, but I think from a purely subjective point of view, I would choose the DM8 over the P2. So to sum this all up, I think the DM8 is a really compelling offering at around about that price point. I'm not suggesting it's the best IEM I've heard, and I do think there's other competitors on the market that are worth considering, but so is the DM8. I think it should be on the shortlist for anybody looking at an IEM in that $350 odd US range. It's well made, it's wonderfully accessorized, you've got lots of different tip options to choose from, it's really comfortable, and you can tip roll to get lots of different tunings to get it just right for you. So if that sounds like an IEM that's interesting to you, I'll put a link down below through to Melbourne Hi-Fi Audio for anybody here in Australia. That's a great way of saying thank you to them for making this review possible. If you're elsewhere in the world, I'll put a more generic link down there for those of you outside Australia. As always, if you found the review useful, please think about hitting the subscribe button and the like button. It really helps to get more reviews like this out to you. In the meantime though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.